Born into privilege but rejected for who he was, he lived among sheet music and silence, until a different voice rose from the crowd, breaking the cycle of loneliness. But to love outside his world would bring more than just glances. It would awaken a silent war. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe so we can keep creating stories like this one. For years, Alexander Morgan had been shaped by a gilded reality. An heir who grew up in the impeccably polished hallways of Daybreak Ranch, where music was constant, smiles rehearsed, and truth often hidden beneath layers of etiquette and formality. The ranch, located on the outskirts of Sonoma Valley, was known throughout California for its impressive colonial architecture, its extensive vineyards, and the fortune accumulated by generations of the Morgan family. Alexander firmly believed that his family represented a symbol of justice, order, and civility. It was the narrative he had been told since childhood, that everyone there was well treated, that the structure was harmonious, that the employees were grateful to serve one of the most influential families in California. The young heir, 30 years old, had everything anyone could desire: education at the best universities abroad, valuable political contacts, and was engaged to Victoria Hayes, daughter of one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. However, everything began to crumble at an unexpected and silent moment. At dawn on a Tuesday, as he walked through the still sleeping hallways of the ranch, seeking a rare moment of solitude before immersing himself in negotiations for the international expansion of the family business, that's when he saw her. Huddled in the corner of a small service room, wearing a worn uniform, sleeping on the cold stone floor, as if she were part of the furniture ignored for decades, that young woman, exhausted and almost invisible, was Lucy Hernandez, a cleaning employee. But not just any employee, something about her. Perhaps the way she pressed her arms against her chest, or the whisper of a sob even while sleeping, awakened in him something he had never felt before. A real concern. Alexander paused, observing her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Why was she sleeping on the floor and not in the staff dormitories? The ranch was known for treating its employees well, at least that's what he had always been told. He approached cautiously, trying not to wake her, and noticed the marks of fatigue on her young face, hands reddened by cleaning chemicals, and a small bruise on her wrist. For the first time, the heir realized that perhaps the kindness so exalted within the limestone walls of the ranch was just a very well-constructed facade. Without alerting the servants or calling security, he decided to discreetly observe the routine of that employee. During the following weeks, Alexander changed his schedules, pretended additional work, and even cancelled some important meetings. What he discovered internally devastated him. Lucy was constantly humiliated by Margaret Sanders, the head of personnel and wife of the ranch's general administrator. Margaret was an influential figure, feared by all, whose reputation was sustained by forced charm and advantageous family alliances. Responsible for supervising the service staff, she exercised her authority like an invisible whip. She humiliated, shouted, imposed inhumane work hours, manipulated reports, and distorted any attempt at complaint. And Lucy, a young woman of barely 23, was her main target. One day, while Alexander observed from a corner of the main hallway, he witnessed how Margaret accused Lucy of having stolen a small silver brooch, something that was evidently false, as he himself had seen Margaret put it in her pocket minutes before. The scene ended with the young woman on her knees, cleaning a puddle of tea that Margaret herself had accidentally spilled. The heir tried at first to follow official procedures. He discreetly communicated his concerns to his father, Thomas Morgan, suggested reforms in the service sector, requested internal audits. But he quickly perceived that, within the ranch, power was more stubborn than truth. "Alexander, my son, you can't be serious," his father told him one afternoon while they reviewed the accounting books in the main office. "Margaret has been with us for more than 20 years. Are you going to believe the complaints of an employee you barely know?" "They're not complaints, Dad. I've seen it with my own eyes," insisted Alexander, gently tapping the mahogany table. "You're exaggerating. You've always been too sensitive," Thomas replied with a condescending smile. You should be focused on the expansion into Europe, not on service gossip. There were those who laughed, those who doubted, those who advised him not to get involved in such trivial matters. Even Victoria, his fiancée, showed little interest when he tried to share his concerns. "My love, why do you worry so much? How about that girl?" she asked during a romantic dinner in the ranch garden. "If you really want to help, make a donation to some foundation. You don't have to get involved in these domestic matters." Faced with these obstacles, Alexander opted for the path that no one expected, to personally approach Lucy, without pomp, without his expensive suits, without titles, just as someone who wanted to understand what was happening. Her resistance was immediate. Accustomed to living like a shadow, the young woman saw any attempt at approach as a trap. The first time Alexander tried to talk to her in the back gardens, Lucy practically fled, trembling with fear. "Please, I don't want any trouble," she murmured, clutching to her chest the freshly washed sheets she was carrying. "I'm not looking to cause you trouble," he replied, maintaining his distance so as not to frighten her more. "I just want to talk." "The bosses never just want to talk with us," she said with a bitterness that surprised him. "If Mrs. Sanders sees me here with you, she'll fire me." Alexander then understood that it wouldn't be easy to earn her trust. And how could it be otherwise? For Lucy, he represented the same system that oppressed her, but the heir's determination did not waver. If there was something that characterized Alexander Morgan, beyond his surname and fortune, it was his tenacity. Over the following weeks, Alexander's respectful insistence, his discreet gestures of kindness, and his silent and attentive listening began to build a bridge between him and Lucy. He left small notes of encouragement in places where he knew only she would find them. He made sure that work schedules were more reasonable when he could subtly intervene. He even intentionally forgot small gifts, a book, a scarf, a small jar of hand cream, in places where she could take them without feeling obligated to thank him. On a rainy day, when Lucy was finishing her exhausting shift, he waited for her near the back door of the ranch with an umbrella. "It's not safe for you to walk alone to town in this storm," he told her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I can drive you in my car, or if you prefer, I can ask James to take you." James was the family's oldest chauffeur, an older man respected by all employees. Alexander had calculated well. By offering an alternative that didn't directly involve him, he gave Lucy the freedom to choose without pressure. To his surprise, she looked him directly in the eyes for the first time. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Morgan? What do you want from me?" The question was loaded with natural distrust, but also with genuine curiosity. Alexander responded with the simplest truth. "I want to understand. I want to know if the ranch that my family has built over generations really is what they've always told me it is." That night, on the journey to Lucy's small apartment in town, under the patter of rain on the car roof, she began to speak. At first they were disconnected fragments, moments of humiliation, 15-hour workdays, the constant fear of losing the job that was the only support for her sick grandmother and younger brother. What Alexander discovered then was even more complex. Lucy was not just a victim of Margaret, but of an entire social system that favored silence. From a family from Oregon that had lost everything during the floods 3 years ago, without resources or protection, she had been brought to the ranch through a labor integration program promoted by Margaret herself, a program that, in theory, sought social inclusion, but in practice was just a disguised form of exploitation. "They promise us training, a good salary, decent housing," Lucy explained, with her gaze fixed on the fogged window. "But when we arrive, they take our documents, deduct the transport, food, uniform from our salary. We end up in debt from the first month." "Does my father know this?" asked Alexander, feeling that the world he knew was crumbling with each word. "Mr. Thomas never deals directly with us. Everything goes through Mrs. Sanders or her husband, and if anyone tries to complain..." Lucy stopped, passing a trembling hand over her face. The last girl who tried to talk to the bosses disappeared the next day. They told us she quit, but she left all her things. Alexander gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. It wasn't possible, he told himself. His family had values, principles. However, the more he reflected, the more he realized how distant he had always been from the daily operation of the ranch. Wasn't that distance a form of complicity? That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He sat on the wide terrace of his room, contemplating the vineyards that stretched out under the moonlight, thinking of all the people who worked those lands, of the hands that had built the Morgan fortune. With each revelation, he felt the weight of his surname as never before. And it was in that process that something unprecedented began to emerge in him, a sense of real purpose. The following days were of frantic activity. Alexander cancelled business meetings, postponed decisions about international expansion, even argued with Victoria, who didn't understand his sudden obsession with administrative matters. "You're ruining our plans, Alexander," she complained during a heated discussion. "The charity gala is in 2 weeks, and instead of accompanying me to choose my dress, you're reviewing labor contracts. What's happening to you?" "I'm discovering who I really am," he replied with a conviction that left her speechless. In hiding from his family, Alexander began to meet with other ranch employees who were also tired of pretending that everything was perfect. With them, he organized secret meetings in a small abandoned house on the edge of the property, collected testimonies, obtained documentary evidence of the abuses. He spent sleepless nights reading contracts, studying American labor laws, looking for legal flaws that could be used in favor of the exploited. Among the allies he found was Jason Orozco, a young accountant who worked under the supervision of Margaret's husband. Jason had noticed discrepancies in the financial records for months, but feared losing his job if he said anything. "The funds destined for the labor integration program are systematically diverted," Jason explained to him, one night showing him carefully copied records. "Only 30% actually reaches the workers. The rest disappears." There was also Rose, the head cook, who from her privileged position in the kitchen had witnessed countless abuses. "Mrs. Sanders forces the girls to work when they're sick," she revealed with a trembling voice. "She made one clean the bathrooms with a high fever until she fainted. Then she fired her for being incompetent." And there was Edward, the trusted gardener, who had been at the ranch for more than 25 years and had seen how, gradually, under the administration of Margaret and her husband, labor conditions had deteriorated. "We used to be like a family," he said nostalgically. "Mr. August, Mr. Thomas's father, knew the name of every employee, cared about us. Now we're just numbers on a spreadsheet." Each new revelation was like a stab for Alexander. It wasn't just about Lucy and her personal situation. It was an entire system of exploitation operating under the prestigious name of the Morgans. His family, who publicly presented themselves as promoters of art, culture, and social development in California, were sustaining their fortune on the suffering of dozens of people. The first serious confrontation occurred when Alexander tried to access the complete files of the personnel department. Margaret, alerted by one of her loyalists, intercepted him in the hallway leading to the administrative offices. "May I know what you're looking for, Mr. Morgan?" she asked with a tense smile, subtly blocking his path. "I just want to understand how the administration works," he replied, maintaining a casual tone. "After all, someday all of this will be my responsibility." "Your father has always trusted us for these mundane details," she replied, emphasizing the last words. "I'm sure you have more important matters to attend to." "Nothing is more important than understanding the foundations of what I will inherit, Mrs. Sanders," he insisted, smiling cordially while the tension grew between them. That same day, at nightfall, Alexander found Lucy nervously waiting for him by his car. "Mr. Morgan, you have to stop," she whispered, constantly looking around. "Mrs. Sanders knows you've been asking questions. This morning she warned all the staff that whoever talks to you about internal matters will be immediately fired." "They can't fire everyone," he replied, trying to calm her. "They can do something worse," she said, and the fear in her eyes was palpable. "They can destroy us. You don't understand how this works. They have power, contacts. If someone is fired from here with a bad reference, they can't get a job on any other ranch in the region." Alexander passed a hand over his face, processing Lucy's words. It was true he hadn't considered all the implications. In his privileged position, he could afford to challenge the system without real consequences. But for Lucy and the other employees, each misstep could mean the loss of their livelihood. "I won't expose you," he assured her, taking her hands delicately, "but I can't stand by knowing what I now know." The young woman looked at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. No one from the Morgan family had ever cared about her, much less taken her hands as Alexander was doing now. For a moment, she felt a strange warmth spreading in her chest, but quickly suppressed it. She couldn't allow feelings that would further complicate her already precarious situation. "I have a plan," continued Alexander, lowering his voice, "but I'll need your help, and that of everyone who's willing to risk a little for real change." That night, in the small abandoned house on the edge of the property, Alexander shared his strategy. With the group they now called the Invisibles, Lucy, Jason, Rose, Edward, and 5 more employees who had joined the cause. The plan was meticulous: collect solid evidence, build an irrefutable legal case, and most importantly, create a support network that would protect any employee who might suffer reprisals. While this silent resistance was taking shape, life on the ranch continued its apparently normal course. Alexander divided his time between his official responsibilities and his clandestine activities. In the eyes of his family, he was finally taking the family business seriously, spending hours reviewing documents and meeting with staff. What they didn't know was what kind of documents he was really reviewing and which staff members he was meeting with. However, tension was mounting. Margaret, always astute, began to notice suspicious patterns. Employees who never used to talk to each other now exchanged knowing looks. Documents that had always been under lock and key mysteriously appeared out of place. And most alarming, Alexander Morgan, the heir who had always shown elegant disinterest in the mundane affairs of the ranch, now seemed omnipresent. The first major confrontation came when Margaret caught Jason copying financial records after working hours. "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret's voice resonated in the empty office, making the young accountant jump from his seat. Just updating my files, Mrs. Sanders," stammered Jason, trying to hide the documents under other papers. "At 8 o'clock at night," the woman approached like a predator to its prey. "Do you take me for stupid, Jason?" What Margaret didn't know was that Alexander was on the other side of the door, listening to everything. He had agreed to meet with Jason to pick up the copies, but arrived a few minutes late. Now his ally was in trouble. Without thinking twice, Alexander burst into the office. "How good to find you both," he exclaimed with a rehearsed smile. "Jason, I was just coming to thank you for staying late helping me with those financial analyses I asked you for. Mrs. Sanders, I'm glad you're here. I'd like to discuss with you some ideas I have for improving administrative efficiency." The tension in the atmosphere was palpable. Margaret looked alternately at Alexander and Jason, her narrowed eyes calculating possibilities, evaluating whether she was facing a coincidence or a conspiracy. "Of course, Mr. Morgan," she finally replied, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm always available for you, but perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting when with your father present. After all, any administrative change must be approved by Mr. Thomas." "You're absolutely right," conceded Alexander, maintaining his facade of cordiality. "I'll talk to my father tonight. Meanwhile, Jason, will you accompany me? I need to discuss a couple more details with you." Alexander practically dragged Jason out of the office, aware of Margaret's penetrating gaze following them until they turned the corner. "That was close," sighed Jason when they were safe in Alexander's private office. "I think she suspects something." "She doesn't just suspect, she's sure," replied Alexander, locking the door. "From now on, we must be extremely cautious, and you," he added, placing a hand on the accountant's shoulder, "need to prepare for the worst. They will likely try to fire you in the coming days." Alexander's predictions proved accurate. The next morning, Thomas Morgan summoned his son to a private meeting in the mansion's main office. The patriarch, a 60-year-old man whose graying hair and distinguished bearing inspired immediate respect, was unusually serious. "Son, Margaret came to talk to me last night," he began. pouring himself a whiskey despite it being barely 10 in the morning. "She's concerned about your excessive interest in administrative matters." Alexander remained impassive. He had anticipated this conversation and was prepared. "Is it excessive? To want to understand how the family business works, Dad?" "No, of course not." Thomas took a sip of his drink. "But there are ways and ways. Margaret says you've been asking questions, reviewing old contracts, meeting with employees alone, all this without consulting with her or with Robert." Robert, Margaret's husband, was officially the general administrator of the ranch, although everyone knew it was his wife who really controlled everything. "I didn't know I needed permission to talk to our employees," replied Alexander, allowing a touch of defiance to filter into his voice. Thomas put the glass on the table and looked directly at his son. "What's really going on, Alexander? Is this some kind of late rebellion, or is there something specific that concerns you?" It was the moment of truth. Alexander could directly confront his father with what he knew, risking that he would turn his back on him, or he could continue playing to detective in the shadows. He decided to take a middle path. "I've noticed some irregularities, Dad," he finally said. "Situations that don't match the values you've always instilled in me, with the Morgan values." Thomas visibly tensed but maintained his composure. "What kind of irregularities?" "Questionable labor conditions, financial discrepancies in the labor integration program, abuses of authority," Alexander enumerated, carefully observing his father's reaction. "Nothing we can't correct, if we act now." The patriarch remained silent for several seconds that seemed eternal. Then, to Alexander's surprise, he let out a brief and bitter laugh. "Your grandfather would be proud," he finally said. "He was just like you, always concerned about everyone's well-being, always vigilant." He paused and his face darkened. "I'm afraid I didn't inherit that quality. I found it easier to delegate, trust, look the other way when it was convenient." Alexander felt the ground moving beneath his feet. Was his father admitting that he knew about the abuses? Or was he simply acknowledging his tendency towards negligence? "Dad, what's happening on the ranch?" "Whatever is happening," interrupted Thomas, raising a hand, "must be corrected. The Morgans have a reputation to maintain, but more importantly, we have principles to defend." He stood up and walked to the window, turning his back on his son. "I need time to think, Alexander. Meanwhile, I ask for discretion. Don't directly confront Margaret or Robert. Let me handle this my way." Alexander nodded, although his father couldn't see him. He felt a strange mixture of relief and concern. His father seemed receptive but also evasive. Would he really take action, or was he just trying to appease him? Upon leaving the office, a familiar figure was waiting for him in the hallway. Victoria, as elegant as always in a summer dress and discreet but expensive jewelry, looked at him with an indecipherable expression. "Am I interrupting an important meeting?" she asked in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer. "Victoria, I wasn't expecting you today," replied Alexander, distractedly kissing her cheek. "Evidently," she replied with a tense smile. "Lately you don't expect anyone who isn't part of your mysterious crusade." Alexander took Victoria's arm and led her towards the gardens. They needed privacy for the conversation that was coming. "I'm sorry I've neglected you these weeks," he began, when they were seated on a stone bench surrounded by bougainvillea. "There are complicated situations that require my attention." Victoria looked at him with a mixture of irritation and genuine concern. "Alexander, we're getting married in less than 6 months. We should be planning our future together, not living in separate worlds." She paused and her eyes softened slightly. "If there are problems on the ranch, you can trust me. My father has experience, contacts, he could help you." For a moment, Alexander considered opening up completely to her. Victoria was intelligent, had resources, but something stopped him. Victoria's father, Ernest Hayes, was known for his ruthless methods in business. If he told him everything, would he really seek justice for the abused employees, or would he simply see the situation as an opportunity to consolidate the business merger he had been pursuing with the Morgans? "I appreciate your offer," he finally replied, "but I need to resolve this on my own. It's personal." Victoria's face momentarily hardened. "It's because of that employee, isn't it?" The cleaning girl. Don't think I haven't noticed, Alexander. All the staff talks about how you spend time with her, about your secret meetings. Her voice acquired a dangerous edge. If you have some kind of fascination with that girl, at least be discreet. We have a reputation to maintain. Alexander looked at her with disbelief. Did Victoria really believe it was an affair? It's not what you think, Vicky, he said, using the diminutive he only employed in intimate moments. Lucy is being a victim of systematic abuse by the administration, and she's not the only one. I'm trying to correct an injustice that occurs under my family's name. Victoria studied him in silence, evaluating the sincerity of his words. Finally, she sighed. You've always been too idealistic, my love. It's one of the things that attracted me to you. She took his hand between hers. But the real world doesn't work that way. You can't save everyone. I'm not trying to save everyone, just those who are under my responsibility. The conversation was interrupted by Jason's arrival, who was approaching hurriedly along the gravel path. His normally composed face showed clear signs of distress. Mr. Morgan, excuse the interruption, he said, casting a cautious glance towards Victoria, but something urgent has occurred. Victoria elegantly stood up, smoothing her dress. I'll leave you with your urgent matters, she said with a tense smile. We'll talk later, Alexander. Remember that dinner with my parents is this Friday. Once Victoria had moved far enough away, Jason collapsed on the bench next to Alexander. I've been fired, he announced without preamble. Robert called me to his office half an hour ago. He said they had found discrepancies in my reports and that the ranch no longer required my services. Alexander clenched his fists. It was exactly what he feared. Did they give you any compensation? Letter of recommendation. Jason let out a bitter laugh. Nothing. In fact, Robert insinuated that I should be grateful they weren't pressing charges for alleged embezzlement. He passed a trembling hand through his hair. Alexander, without a positive reference, I won't be able to get another accounting job in the entire region. It was a calculated blow, designed not only to eliminate Jason as a threat, but to send a message to any other employee who considered joining Alexander's cause. Margaret and Robert were counterattacking. Don't worry, said Alexander, putting a hand on his friend's shoulder. We had anticipated this, remember? I have an apartment in the city that you can use temporarily, and contacts at companies in New York that wouldn't be intimidated by Margaret's tactics. But they both knew that damage was done. Jason's dismissal meant they had lost direct access to the ranch's financial records. Worse yet, it was a clear warning to the other members of the Invisibles. That night, the group's meeting in the abandoned house had a somber tone. Jason recounted the details of his dismissal, while the others listened in tense silence. The pie. Fear was palpable. They're going to go after all of us one by one, said Rose the cook, hugging herself. First Jason, then who knows? We should stop, suggested one of the younger workers. We can't risk our jobs. Many of us have families to feed. Alexander looked at them all, aware that he was at a crossroads. He could understand the fear, the hesitation. He himself had grown up protected by his surname and fortune, never having to worry about how he would pay for his next meal. What right did he have to ask them to take risks? It was Lucy who broke the silence, to everyone's surprise. If we give up now, nothing will ever change, she said in a soft but firm voice. What good is having a job if we live in constant fear, if we're treated like disposable objects? She turned to Alexander. I'm still with you. Her words seemed to infuse new determination into the group. One by one they nodded, reaffirming their commitment. The fight would continue, but they needed to change strategy. We need to accelerate our plan, decided Alexander. We can no longer operate gradually from within. We need to present our case at once with all the evidence we have. And to whom will we present it? Asked Edward, the old gardener. To Mr. Thomas? We've already seen that he prefers to believe. Margaret over his own son. Alexander remained silent for a moment. It was true his father had shown willingness to listen, but also reluctance to act decisively. They needed something more forceful, something that couldn't be ignored. We'll present it to the entire board of directors, he finally declared. My grandfather established that the ranch would be administered by a family council, not just by my father. There are uncles, cousins who have a voice and vote. If we expose the case before all of them, with solid evidence, it will be impossible to sweep it under the rug. The plan was risky. The board met only quarterly, and the next meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Until then, they should maintain a low profile, protect the evidence already collected, and try to gather more without exposing themselves. The following days passed in a tense, apparent calm. Alexander resumed his normal activities, even accompanied Victoria to dinner with her parents, where Ernest Hayes, a corpulent man with an easy smile but calculating eyes, made several comments about the imminent fusion of two great business dynasties. Margaret and Robert, for their part, seemed satisfied with having eliminated Jason. They decreased surveillance, believing they had dealt a definitive blow to any attempt at rebellion. It was this excess of confidence that allowed Lucy to make a crucial discovery. One afternoon, while cleaning Margaret's private office, she noticed that the woman had left one of her drawers open when she rushed out to take a call. In the drawer, perfectly visible, was a folder labeled Integration Program, Confidential, Agreements. With her heart racing frantically, Lucy made a decision that could cost her everything. She took out her cell phone, a basic model that barely had a camera, and quickly began photographing the documents in the folder. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. There were agreements signed with local officials to divert government funds destined for social programs, contracts with abusive terms that workers signed under coercion, even evidence of bribes to labor inspectors to ignore flagrant violations of the law. She was so concentrated on her task that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching down the hallway. When the door opened abruptly, Lucy barely had time to put the phone in her uniform pocket, but she wasn't fast enough to close the folder and return it to the drawer. "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret's voice resonated like a whip in the room. Lucy felt the floor vanishing beneath her feet, caught red-handed with no possibility of a reasonable explanation. I was cleaning, Mum," she stammered, knowing how weak her excuse sounded. "The drawer was open and I thought I should tidy it." Margaret advanced slowly toward her, like a panther cornering its prey. Her face, normally composed in a studied mask of kindness, now showed its true nature: cold, calculating, ruthless. "You're lying," she hissed. "I've been watching you, Lucy. You and your little conspirator friends. Do you think I don't know what Alexander and you have been plotting?" She took the folder from the young woman's trembling hands. "How much have you seen?" Lucy remained silent, debating between continuing to lie or directly confronting the situation. Any option seemed to lead to the same catastrophic result. Margaret smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It doesn't matter. Either way, today you'll stop working on this ranch, and I'll personally make sure that no decent family in all of California ever hires you again." She took another step towards her. "But first, give me your phone." "I don't carry my phone during work," Lucy lied, aware of the weight of the device in her pocket. "It's in the dormitories." The slap came without warning, with such force that Lucy almost lost her balance. The metallic taste of blood flooded her mouth as Margaret roughly grabbed her by the arm. "Don't you dare lie to me! Give me that phone right now!" What happened next occurred with the speed of lightning. The door flew open, and Alexander burst into the office, his face transformed by a fury that no one had ever seen in the always composed air of the Morgans. "Let her go immediately," he ordered in a voice that admitted no reply. Margaret released Lucy's arm, but maintained her defiant posture. Well, the prince to the rescue of his damsel," she said with contempt. "You arrived just in time to see how I fire this thief for rummaging through confidential documents." "The only thief? Here is you, Margaret," replied Alexander, advancing until he stood between the woman and Lucy. "Stealing these people's dignified work, embezzling funds, abusing your power. Yes, we know everything." For an instant, something like fear crossed Margaret's eyes, but she quickly regained her composure. "Be careful with your accusations, young man. Your father will never believe the fantasies of a maid and a rebellious son over my word. I've built this ranch alongside the Morgans for decades." "They're not fantasies," intervened Lucy, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. "They're facts, and I have proof." She slowly took the phone from her pocket, showing it to Margaret, whose eyes widened. "Every document, every forged signature, every illegal agreement, it's all here." What followed was a frenzy of events. Margaret tried to snatch the phone, Alexander restrained her, and in the midst of the struggle, Robert appeared at the door, alerted by the shouts. Seeing his wife in apparent danger, he didn't hesitate to lunge at Alexander. The physical confrontation was brief but intense. Alexander, despite his refined education, had practiced horseback riding and polo all his life, and had the necessary strength to defend himself. He managed to dodge Robert and in a quick move immobilized him against the desk. "Enough!" shouted Thomas Morgan from the door. The patriarch had been alerted by the noises and now contemplated the scene with a mixture of surprise and anger. What the hell is going on here? The silence that followed was dense, loaded with tensions accumulated over years. Margaret was the first to speak, taking advantage of her long relationship with the patriarch. "Mr. Thomas, your son has lost his mind," she said, composing her disheveled image from the struggle. "He's been conspiring with the employees, encouraging insubordination and even," she looked significantly at Lucy, "developing inappropriate relationships. Now he has assaulted Robert when we were trying to stop this girl, who was stealing confidential documents." Thomas looked at his son, seeking an explanation. Alexander knew this was the crucial moment. Everything they had worked for, all the risks they had taken came down to this instant. "Dad, Margaret and Robert have been abusing their position for years," he said calmly. "They've created a system of exploitation under our noses, using the prestige of the Morgan name to cover up illegal practices." He pointed to Lucy. "This young woman and many other employees have suffered indescribable abuses, while you and I lived in our bubble of privilege." Thomas maintained his impenetrable expression. Decades of business negotiations had taught him not to reveal his thoughts. "Very serious accusations, my son. Do you have proof?" It was then that Lucy stepped forward, still trembling but with determination shining in her eyes. "I have it, Mr. Thomas," she said, offering him her phone. "It's all here. The abusive contracts, the diversion of funds, the bribes, everything." The patriarch looked at the small device, as if it were a relic from another world. Finally, he took it and began reviewing the photographs under the anxious gaze of all those present. His face, normally impassive, changed as he went from one image to another. Disbelief, shock, and finally, a cold and controlled fury. "Margaret, Robert," he said in a voice so soft that everyone had to strain to hear it. "I want you out of my sight immediately. Don't leave the ranch until I authorize it. We'll have a very long conversation later." The couple exchanged a panicked look. This wasn't what they had anticipated. Thomas Morgan had always blindly trusted them, delegating more and more responsibilities as the years passed. "Mr. Thomas, think carefully about what you're doing," tried Margaret. "Those documents are being misinterpreted. Everything we've done has been for the good of the ranch, of the Morgan family." "I said get out," repeated Thomas, this time with a tone that left no room for discussion. Once Margaret and Robert had left, the patriarch turned to his son and Lucy. For the first time, he really looked at the young woman, not as part of the invisible furniture that kept the ranch running, but as a human being. What he saw, the marks of chronic fatigue, dignity, despite fear, determination, despite vulnerability, seemed to move him. "Miss," he began, realizing he didn't even know her full name. "Guadalupe Hernandez, sir," she replied softly. "Lucy to everyone." "Miss Hernandez," continued Thomas, "I apologize for what you've had to endure in this house." He turned to Alexander. "And to you, son, I owe an even greater apology. I should have listened to you from the beginning." An invisible weight seemed to lift from Alexander's shoulders. After weeks of struggle, of feeling isolated even within his own family, finally his father was on his side. "What's important now is to correct the damage, Dad," he said. Thomas nodded, a new determination visible on his face. "We'll move up the board of directors meeting to tomorrow. Everyone needs to know what has been happening under our name, and there must be consequences." Events precipitated in the following hours. Thomas ordered security to discreetly watch Margaret and Robert to prevent them from destroying additional evidence or leaving the property. He urgently summoned all members of the board of directors, uncles, cousins, and historical partners of the Morgans, and in a significant gesture, he asked Lucy to gather all the affected employees for a special hearing. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. Too many contradictory emotions boiled inside him. Relief, because the truth would finally come to light, anxiety about the repercussions, and a growing certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Near dawn, he heard a soft knock at his door. It was Victoria. Dressed with unusual simplicity for her face without makeup, she seemed younger and more vulnerable. "May I come in?" she asked in a voice that didn't resemble her usual tone, of absolute confidence. Alexander nodded, stepping aside. They had seen each other briefly during the chaos of the previous day, but hadn't had a real opportunity to talk. Now, in the intimacy of dawn, words seemed inadequate. "They told me what happened," she finally said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "My father received the emergency call for the board. He's furious." "With you? With me?" "With Margaret and Robert," clarified Victoria. "Apparently, they've also been manipulating some business agreements with my family's companies." She paused, and her eyes met Alexander's. "And with myself." "Why with you?" "For not supporting you, for not seeing what you saw." Her voice broke, slightly. "Alexander, I'm sorry. I should have trusted you. I should have listened to you when you tried to explain what was happening." The meeting room of Daybreak Ranch had never hosted a meeting like the one taking place that morning. Around the huge carved oak table sat not only the usual members of the Morgan Board of Directors, but also representatives of the workers. It was an unprecedented image. Mr. August Morgan III, the conservative uncle who managed the family wineries, sitting next to Edward, the old gardener. Cousin Cecilia, a renowned corporate lawyer, listening attentively to Rose, the cook. Thomas presided over the meeting with a gravity that reflected the significance of the moment. Alexander remained standing next to the screen where, one after another, the evidence collected during weeks of clandestine investigation was projected. The photographs taken by Lucy of Margaret's confidential documents had been just the tip of the iceberg. Now, with Thomas's full authority backing them, they had access to digital files, private correspondence, bank records. The story that emerged was darker than anyone had imagined. Margaret and Robert had built, over more than a decade, an elaborate system of labor exploitation. They recruited vulnerable workers, mainly from impoverished indigenous and rural communities, under the promise of a better future. Once on the ranch, they subjected them to abusive contracts, document retention, arbitrary deductions, and constant threats. The prestigious Labor Integration Program that the Morgan family promoted as their contribution to California's social development was, in reality, a facade to obtain practically free labor and divert government funds. "This is inconceivable," murmured August as he reviewed the figures of the diversions. "How could this happen under our noses?" "Because we chose not to see," replied Thomas bitterly. "We completely delegated. We concentrated on the benefits and public image, and we forgot our most basic responsibility to ensure that our success wasn't built on the suffering of others." Reactions among family members ranged from genuine indignation to concern about the potential scandal. Some, like Cecilia, were already calculating the legal implications, the possible criminal charges, the damage mitigation strategies. Others, like Ernest Hayes, Victoria's father, saw the matter primarily as a public relations problem that needed to be contained quickly. "First things first," declared Ernest, placing his hands on the table. "We must ensure that this doesn't reach the press. A scandal like this could destroy the brand value of Morgan Wines." "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes," intervened Alexander, "I think we're focusing on the wrong aspect. What should concern us is not the potential damage to our reputation, but the real damage we've already caused to dozens of people." At his side, Lucy, who had been invited as the main representative of the affected workers, remained silent, but attentive. Dressed in simple but dignified clothes, hastily provided by Victoria the night before, She seemed out of place in that luxury environment. However, her presence was perhaps the most important of all, a living reminder of the human consequences of corporate decisions. The discussion continued for hours, addressing every aspect of the problem: what to do with Margaret and Robert, how to compensate the workers who had suffered abuse, what structural reforms to implement to ensure that something like this would never happen again. Opinions were divided, sometimes heatedly. The more conservative members of the family argued that the matter should be handled internally with discretion, perhaps through private indemnifications, and the quiet exit of Margaret and Robert. Others, led by Alexander and surprisingly supported by Thomas, insisted on a more transparent and reparative approach. It was during one of the most tense moments of the debate when Lucy finally spoke. Her voice, soft but firm, captured the attention of all those present. "If I may," she began, with a dignity that impressed even the most skeptical. "I'm not here seeking revenge. Neither I nor my colleagues want to destroy the ranch or the Morgan family. What we want is justice and respect." She paused, looking for the right words. "Many of us come from places where we had no opportunities. We arrived here with hope, willing to work hard for a better future. We don't ask for charity, just fair treatment." The room fell silent. For the first time in the history of Morgan board meetings, a worker's voice was heard with the same attention as that of the shareholders. "Employees are not your enemies," continued Lucy, gaining confidence. "We are part of what makes this ranch great. If you treat us with dignity, we will work with more dedication. If you give us security, we will respond with loyalty. If you offer us a real path to grow, we will all grow together." Her words resonated with a simple but powerful truth. Even Ernest Hayes, initially focused on containing damages, seemed reflective. Alexander looked at Lucy with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that he dared not name. In the weeks they had been working together, he had discovered in her a strength and intelligence that defied all his preconceived notions. Every day he learned something new: her passion for reading despite having had to leave school early, her ability to organize and lead even from the shadows, her unbreakable sense of justice that didn't seek revenge but reparation. Across the table, Victoria observed the interaction between her fiancé and the young employee. There was something there, a connection, a mutual understanding that went beyond words. For the first time, she wondered if the place beside Alexander, that she had always taken for granted, really belonged to her. At the end of the exhausting day, the board of directors reached a series of historic decisions for Daybreak Ranch. Margaret and Robert would be formally reported to the authorities. There would be no cover-up or protection for those who had abused the family's trust and harmed so many people. The Morgans would publicly assume their responsibility for not having exercised proper supervision and committed to fully cooperating with any investigation. A compensation fund would be established for all affected workers, administered by an independent committee that would include representatives of the employees themselves. There would not only be economic compensation, but also real training programs, medical care, and educational opportunities. The labor integration program would be completely restructured under new principles of transparency, equity, and authentic development. And, in a revolutionary move for a traditional American family business, a workers' council would be created with a voice and vote in certain administrative decisions. To oversee this transformation, Thomas proposed the creation of a new position, Director of Social and Labor Responsibility, and to everyone's surprise, he named Lucy as the principal advisor to the committee that would define the functions and scope of this new position. The perspective of someone who has lived the injustices is invaluable to ensure that the solutions are real and not merely cosmetic, he explained, to the astonished looks of some family members. 3 months later, Daybreak Ranch was a transformed place. Margaret and Robert faced a judicial process that promised to be long and complex, but had already served to expose similar practices in other companies in the region. The workers, initially fearful that the promises would remain on wet paper, were beginning to see concrete changes: better wages, decent housing, access to education for their children. Alexander, who had assumed a more active role in the administration, spent hours working alongside Lucy and the newly formed Workers' Council. The closeness between them had evolved into something that neither dared to define. More than friendship, different from traditional romance, a bond forged in the shared struggle for justice. Victoria had been the first to recognize what was happening. One afternoon, as they walked through the vineyards, she took Alexander's hands in hers. "I think we should talk about our engagement," she said with a serenity that surprised him. "Vicky, You don't need to explain anything," she interrupted him with a sad but genuine smile. "What you've done these weeks, the way you've fought for what you believe in, has shown me a facet of you that I didn't know and deeply admire." She paused, looking towards the fields that stretched to the horizon. "But it has also shown me that our paths are heading in different directions." "I never wanted to hurt you," he murmured, feeling a knot in his throat. "I know. And you haven't hurt me. You freed me from a future that maybe was never right for either of us." Victoria returned the engagement ring, a gesture loaded with meaning but devoid of drama. "You'll find your path, Alexander, and I think you've already found the person with whom you want to walk it." The breakup, to the surprise of both families, was amicable. Ernest Hayes, initially furious at what he considered an affront to family honor, eventually recognized that the transformation of the Morgan Ranch represented a business opportunity. Being pioneers in ethical labor practices was generating unexpected positive attention in international markets sensitive to corporate social responsibility. A year after that morning, when Alexander discovered Lucy sleeping on the floor of a service room, the ranch celebrated its first Solidarity Festival, an event that brought together workers, managers, and the local community on an equal footing. Among music, food, and dance, the old rigid hierarchies temporarily blurred, creating a space where everyone recognized themselves as an essential part of the same project. At a quiet moment, Alexander found Lucy observing the sunset from a small hill. She was no longer the fearful young woman from before. Now, as the Labor Welfare Coordinator, the title that had finally been agreed upon for her position, she walked around the ranch with a serene confidence. She had completed her secondary education and was pursuing university studies remotely, balancing her work with her personal development. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her. "About how fragile and how strong change can be," she replied, without taking her gaze from the horizon tinted with orange and purple. "One day, everything seems immovable, eternal. The next, a small crack appears, and suddenly, structures we believed solid as stone transform." Alexander nodded, understanding perfectly. He himself had experienced that transformation, from privileged and distant heir to a man committed to a vision of justice that he had not even conceived before. "You know," she continued, turning to look at him directly, "the most valuable thing you've done isn't changing policies or creating new programs. It's demonstrating that even those born in the greatest privilege can choose to see beyond their own circumstances. They can choose empathy over indifference." "You say it as if it had been a heroic act," he smiled, "when in reality it was simply human." "Perhaps that's what's heroic," replied Lucy, "choosing to be human when it would be easier to be just a title, a surname, a bank account." The silence that followed was charged with possibilities. Both knew that their relationship had evolved into uncharted territory. It wasn't the typical story of love between the boss and the employee that soap operas so romanticize. It was something more complex, more authentic, an alliance between equals forged in shared struggle, a bond based on mutual respect and genuine admiration. Lucy had systematically rejected any personal advantage that might derive from her closeness to the Morgan family. She insisted on earning each recognition on her own merit, on remaining true to her roots and her community, and it was precisely that integrity that most attracted Alexander. "And what's next?" he asked, aware that the question encompassed much more than the ranch's next projects. "We keep building," she replied with simplicity, "one day at a time, one just decision at a time, knowing that the road will be long and that there will be resistance inside and out, but also knowing that what we're creating here can inspire others." As the sun completely disappeared, giving way to a sky sprinkled with stars, Alexander had the certainty that the true legacy of the Morgans would not be their vineyards, their award-winning wines, or their accumulated fortune. It would be this new business model they were building, one where human dignity was not sacrificed for the sake of economic benefit, where success was measured not only in figures, but in lives, positively transformed. And he also knew that regardless of how his personal relationship with Lucy evolved, the bond they had forged had already irrevocably changed the course of both lives and many more. At Daybreak Ranch, as its name suggested, a new day had begun. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Alexander and Lucy has moved you and made you reflect on the transformative power of empathy and justice. To continue this emotional journey, we have prepared a special list with equally captivating stories about personal transformations and struggles for dignity. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life, human relationships, and the social changes that are possible when we choose to see beyond our own circumstances. What would you do in Alexander's place? Or in Lucy's? We await you in the comments to continue this conversation about the power of change